So the government is not only spending fortunes to put out its own message, it will not allow that message to be challenged. And that, to my mind, is deeply worrying.
Jon Dobinson, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Tell me a little bit more about recovery. Where did it come from? What was the reason it was created?
Hi, yes, thanks for having me. Recovery was launched at the end of October last year. And the thinking was really that we'd been through the spring lockdown. We seemed to be easing. We seemed to be returning to our senses. And then suddenly the ratchet started to tighten again. We were seeing the restrictions coming back in. And it had stopped making sense as a narrative to me at that point. I'd always felt that what we were doing was an overreaction, that the cure was likely to be worse than the disease. But as long as we were returning to sanity, I could see why the government had done what it had done. When we started to reimpose restrictions, and a government survey in the summer had said that potentially 200,000 people could lose their lives, not because of COVID, but because of the restrictions and the lockdowns, it really stopped making sense. And I thought somebody has got to stand up and do something about this. I'd had a lot of experience, both in human rights, because I used to be Secretary General of the International Society for Human Rights, and also in communications, because for 30 years I've been in communications, and I've done a lot of work in government. I have a lot of friends who have expertise in areas like mental health, like medicine, lots of friends in business. And as a coalition, we felt we could come together and provide a force to make the case for recovery that no one else was doing. And that's what we wanted to do.
And of course, it is very much about media, isn't it? Because the government has become probably the biggest advertiser, otherwise known as peddler of propaganda, in the United Kingdom. And of course, that does have the effect of squeezing out smaller advertisers, including presumably Recovery.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely astonishing the amounts that the government has spent. So I think only a week or two ago, they gave the advertising spend for last year by the government, and it was £184 million, which makes the government the largest advertiser in the UK last year. And that advertising has been overwhelmingly on heightening the level of our fear. That's a very, very dangerous thing to do. Fear is a very dangerous tool for governments to use to control behaviour. And that is what the government has really, without apology, set out to do. On top of that 184 million, of course, there's an enormous amount that we see all around us that's unpaid for publicity. So everywhere we go, in a supermarket, in a railway station, wherever it might be, there are huge posters, all with the same message. And 184 million is the tip of the iceberg. And then on top of that, of course, the government is pumping out messages every day and using the same sort of frightening language, frightening imagery. When you take it all together, it's probably, and collectively look at what's happening around the world as well, it's probably the biggest campaign of fear the world has ever seen.
Yeah, and of course you only have to walk down to the supermarket, and it continues with the sea of masks everywhere as well, lest we forget about the campaign. You tell us a little bit about your End the Campaign of Fear, the poster campaign that you were planning on putting out. Real difficulty actually getting that placed, getting media organizations to take it.
It's been extraordinary. One of the shocks for me right from the start of this campaign really has been how many barriers there are to freedom of speech. If you want to put questions, if you want to critique the government's approach, even in the most moderate and balanced way, using the government's own data, it is very, very hard to do so. And what we wanted to do with the campaign of fear really should have been something, I think, that's completely acceptable in any democratic society. What we're saying, first of all, the message, very simple: end the campaign of fear. And the reason for that is because millions of people are suffering mental health problems. And very simply, that was our message. We've got to a point now where half the adult population is vaccinated in the UK. That includes all the frontline staff and the vulnerable people who the government was most worried about protecting. Okay, you could make a case, maybe, I think it's unethical, but you could have made a case for fear while there was still a case to be made for people to comply. When we've reached this point in which fear is so ingrained in people, compliance is so ingrained in people, there is no longer a case for using fear, and particularly now that we can increasingly see the consequences in terms of what it's doing to people. Mm-hmm. The Office for National Statistics during the first lockdown said that 6,000 people had died unnecessarily because they were too scared to seek treatment they needed in the hospital. Now, they're no longer collecting those figures, or if they are, they're not publishing them. So we don't know how many more have died since, but we know that with the fear continuing, that is likely to have been sustained. So we're talking about thousands and thousands of people who have died simply because they were terrified. They were frightened to death and unable to seek the help they needed. On top of that, you've got a massive rise in problem of drinking, and we know that deaths through alcohol have gone through the roof as a result of the pandemic. You can see measure after measure, and sadly, of course, tragically amongst young people, suicide. Measure after measure showing the impact of the restrictions, the lockdowns, the loneliness, and the fear. The government has to look at that and say, as the mental health charity Mind has done, we are facing a mental health pandemic. And it's a serious pandemic, potentially a more serious pandemic than the one that we're trying to tackle. It's time that we actually took a step back. So we wanted to put that message out. We put it on posters in a simple form. But then what came back is that we're not allowed to put that message out. We went to the largest poster company in the world, JC&Co, and said to them, we would like to run a poster. They turned around and said, we're banning your poster. And the extraordinary thing was they said, we're banning your poster because it's political. So we went back and said, but there is no restriction on political advertising in the UK. And they said, oh, it's the Code of Advertising Practice. But the Code of Advertising Practice only mentions politics in order to exempt entirely from any regulation advertising that's put out as a result of it during an election campaign or for a referendum, because those claims can't be scrutinized. Mm-hmm. It doesn't say anything about banning political advertising at all, so it was completely untrue. And we're being censored, I think, because JC&Co is in receipt of huge amounts of advertising budget from the government. So the government is not only spending fortunes to put out its own message, it will not allow that message to be challenged. And that, to my mind, is deeply worrying.
Absolutely, and of course it's confirmed in the survey results that you've undertaken as well. You know, the fact that 15% of your respondents indicated that they had either had periods of anxiety or even indeed depression as a result of the fear campaign. It seems remarkable too that the government is yet to produce its cost-benefit analysis, of course, for the lockdown. It was much lauded for a while that they were going to be producing it, and it has never been produced, despite the billions spent on this campaign.
Yeah, I think it's extraordinary that the government is prepared to take unprecedented measures and yet not consider the damage that they might do. We know, because academics independently have taken the initiative to study some of the effects, that they are potentially absolutely enormous. I mean, you may, I'm sure, recall Bristol University's risk management team looking at the potential loss of life from the economic impacts of the early lockdown, and they arrived at an extraordinary figure of 560,000 lives. As many people, British people, as lost their lives in the Second World War because of the economic impact and the effect that has on shortening all our lives. You would think that with figures like that, the government would say, hang on a minute, we really need to investigate the impact this is having on people. But it has chosen not to do so. And I think in the mental health area in particular, there are such serious concerns now. Our survey looked, as you say, at adult mental health. And what we found, we used the independent company Yonder to put together a really robust survey, completely independent of us. And the figures that they came back with were truly shocking. So we had 15% of all adults in the UK reporting specifically that the government advertising had made them feel depressed or anxious or another mental health condition. 15% of adults is equivalent to about 8 million people in the UK reporting a problem specifically because of the government advertising campaign. On top of that, there were a further 7% of adults who said that they had already got a mental health problem requiring treatment, and that the government campaign had exacerbated it, which in many ways is even more worrying when you look at what's happening to suicide and problem drinking, and also the increase in the use of antidepressants since lockdown started. And 3% of people, that's the equivalent of about 1.5 million people nationwide, said that the government advertising had actually triggered a mental health problem that they did not previously have. Now, considering that's taxpayers' money being used to pay for vast numbers of people in the country having serious issues, we have to question whether that was a prudent thing to do, whether the approach taken by the government was the right thing to do. That's what we wanted to do, and that's what we were prevented from doing. It's a really serious concern when there are legitimate, very grave questions over the actions of the government. There is damage being done to people on a massive scale, potentially. And not only is the government unprepared to look at it, to investigate it, to think about it, and to even admit it might be happening itself, it silences those who want to raise those questions and prevents them from being able to have that debate.
Yeah.
That is a very sad situation for a society which little more than a year ago was free, open, and where we all had the liberty to discuss, to raise, to debate questions completely freely without any check.
Absolutely.
It's a huge, huge change, and one that troubles me that more of the general public in this country have not asked questions about.
Yeah, and absolutely, and I think it's so worthy that you are asking the questions and putting it out there, because obviously a lot of people just will accept whatever they're told by the government, and many of us are appalled at what's happening to both democracy and liberty in this country. Just my final question for you today: we're seeing the debate on the extension of the Coronavirus Act. The Liberals, at least, have stated that they're going to vote against the extension, which is something of a breakthrough. It looks as though we're seeing the development of some opposition. But what's your feeling? Is it going to be extended? Is the government going to win the vote?
The feedback I've had talking to a variety of MPs is that they don't anticipate it's possible to defeat the government today. I think the key is, though, the size of that, of the number of MPs who say no. Every extra MP saying no to this will make the government think. It may not stop them, they may have the powers, but using those powers is a different thing. If a lot of MPs get behind this, if there's an overwhelming majority, I think the government will feel pretty justified in unchecked use and potential abuse of those powers. If a lot of MPs say no, then I think we will start to see the debate change. And it will affect the media as well.
Yeah.
And one of the drivers of this has been the unquestioning support of the BBC and Sky, justified, they say, by the fact there are Ofcom rules in place that prevent them from having open debate on these issues. They can no longer report, they say, anything that might harm compliance with restrictions. And that in itself is a deeply worrying thing and has legitimized a sensationalizing of the debate that really shouldn't have taken place. But I think if those broadcasters can see in Parliament MPs, including the Lib Dems now, standing up and saying, hang on a minute, enough is enough, too much has been taken, we need now to draw a line, then I think that will send a message to broadcasters too. And that's really important, because it's not just about what happens in Westminster. The reason Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer are going along with this is they think it's popular. Boris is looking at a 13-point poll lead right now because he's put draconian limitations in place on people's freedom. People are terrified and they're not thinking straight. And I think he will get punished at some point, because at some point they'll start thinking again. And when they do, they will realize the huge amount they've lost personally, financially, in freedoms, in mental health, in physical health. The amount that they have lost is enormous. And that will come back to bite Boris Johnson at some point. But right now, he's looking at a 13-point poll lead and he thinks he's free and clear. That has to change, and it starts today with a big vote against this in Parliament. So I really hope the MPs will say no in sufficient quantity to be a wake-up call.
I hope so too, John. And I'd like to thank you very much indeed for joining me, and keep up the fight.
Certainly will. Thank you. Cheers.